Hi, I'm Matt Rosu. I'm at Susquehanna University, and here with Carola, who will introduce herself in a moment. I created this short video to discuss a little bit about some of the issues on deception in agricultural and applied economics experiments specifically. What are some of the issues surrounding it? When to use it? When not to use it? What is meant by deception? And a few other things. Carola?
Hi, welcome from me as well. My name is Carola Grebitus and I'm Associate Professor at Arizona State University. So what are some potentially deceptive techniques? You can see a long list here, and there are probably others that we may not have listed here. But the most severe, I would say, is when participants are subjected to physical and psychological trauma. You may be aware of the Milton experiment, where participants thought they were giving electric shocks to other participants, and that caused them, in some cases, severe trauma. However, those electric shocks never took place because the electric chair was what we call a bogus device. So that was deception in itself. And then the other participant was also not a participant. It was what we call a confederate. So it was someone part of the experimental team. And then there are other techniques that are probably not as severe when we give them false information, or if we don't give them complete information about what's going on in the experiment. However, what is probably true for all of these cases is that we are partially lying to participants. If you promise your participants a payment and in the end they don't receive any payment, that would be deceptive. Or if you tell them they are buying an organic product, organic apples, but it's really conventional apples, then that would also be considered a deceptive technique. Now, you may wonder, why is that bad if it's happening in the name of research, right? So there are two considerations that we can have. One is ethical reasons, and the other one is, what about public good impacts? From an ethical point of view, there are actually two sides. One is what we call the deontological view. Here we have researchers who say that any violation of our respondents' human rights are prohibitive. Like we should not violate their human rights at all. So they are the prohibitionists, and they also claim that there are no economic theories they could not be tested without deception. But then there's this other view where we say, maybe we have to weigh the costs of violating human rights against the cost of not being able to test certain theories. Or maybe there are some societal issues that are so important to be investigated that couldn't be investigated without deception, that really outweighs the cost. And which view you follow is pretty much up to you. When it comes to the public goods, it's a bit different, because when you think of experiments that mainly use students on campuses, if we use deception and we inform those participants at the end of the experiment about the deception, then they may go with that perspective into the next experiment. And that can really, let's say, contaminate the subject pool. If they haven't been paid in their first experiment where they were promised payment, maybe they will just change their behavior in the next experiment and say, like, why should I make an effort here? I won't be paid anyways. So that is really a completely different issue and can, in the long run, really bias results of our experiments.
Yeah, I mean, before I get into this, on the, I think on the public goods one, I think there'd be a difference, and this is an argument, like these are the two arguments that those who've opposed deception, really, they say it's either unethical or the public goods. The public goods, I think, is a terrible reason to have a journal-based ban, right? You could argue, I could actually make the argument that Arizona State University could have something that says you may not deceive ever. The other thing I would note is I don't know any economics experiments that have ever not paid people. maybe it's happened, but I think more of it's a little bit more borderline on some of the things. Certainly not paying people is, I think, fraud. I mean, if you promise them a payment and you don't. But if you tell them something as a fact and it really wasn't a fact, okay, you've deceived them. Is that that if they know they were deceived, they may not trust in the future. So I could make a really strong case for any college or university saying this, but I can't make any plausible case where a journal would impose that or an organization would impose that. For most of, like, for example, I do experiments with smokers in a general population. How in the world are they going to know whether economists in their experiments deceive or not? They just simply won't. The probability is so low. So I thought one of the arguments to ban deception at the face of it from a journal level was just silly. And that's the public good one. And that's my opinion on this, but others did disagree. But you can go to the next slide. I just wanted to chime in. I don't know what you think on that.
Let me just follow up on that, because I think you're bringing up a good point, Matt. The question is, when we talk about deception in economic experiments, who is really making decisions, right? Is it journals making decisions to say, like, we will not publish any research that has used deception? Or is it economic or agriculture economic associations who say, like, we want our members to adhere to certain standards? Or is it researchers, or as you say, universities per se, who say, like, this is at our university, we want to protect the students, for example, who are subjects from deceptive techniques?
Yeah, and you could even argue at a university that it's not even about protecting the students, it's about protecting the quality of the research from the university. We want to protect students as well. You could go to the next slide here, thing. So deceptions happened in agricultural economics and applied economics experiments. And I put one of mine up there. If you look at the list, paper I had in 2006 with Jay Corrigan, we looked at posted prices. There used to be this kind of common method in applied experiments where you just sell the same item in an auction 10 straight rounds, and you would post the price after each round. And Jay and I kind of thought, this seems crazy. Why would we do that? And the argument was, okay, this is a market setting. You want market feedback. You get market feedback when you go to a grocery store. But what we found is if you start people out, though, when you have one very high bidder, well, their bids are different than if they're in a room without the high bidder. Well, the way we did this was somebody was literally planted in there who bid high, and that was a form of deception. Not providing all useful information on a product. I've done a lot of studies that have given people information. I think it'd be very tough for any researcher to claim they've given all the information. Or what happens if you give information, for example, from the viewpoint of an environmental group versus scientists who might have very different views on something, right? That could be, some people would say that's deception. A bogus device, the famous kind of soup bowl, automatically refilling soup bowl by Wansek and his colleagues is a good example of a device that automatically refilled soup. People didn't know it was being refilled, and so they kept eating. Well, that would have been a tough one to do without deceiving people. And then bidding on novel products. So where I know that this has come up is what happens if there's a product that's not yet on the market, but you know it's going on the market. If you want to assess through, say, an auction, you either have to scrap the study and not do it, or you would have to mislabel a product, collect bids on it. And that's something that researchers would just really have to consider when thinking about this. If you could go to the next slide, and we're back to you.
So now that you've learned a little bit about what deception is and what studies are out there, and that there might be some controversy, what could possibly be any other arguments for allowing the use of deception in experiments? Well, the first one would be that people say it's not too bad. Like that is true in some instances. If we don't give them the full information, that might not be too bad. However, we would say in this case, just don't use that as a rationale to not go to all length at trying to have your experiment without any deceptive techniques. The next claim would be that deception does not change results, and there have been studies that looked at how are results different when the sample or some participants had been exposed to deception versus those who had not been exposed to deception. However, looking at that, we would say that the information that was provided was so general that we could actually not really claim that that is true. So we simply do not have enough information whether that is really true. And the same holds for evidence that indirect experience with deception matters or doesn't matter. In that case, the perspective would be, if you're a freshman and you have never heard about deception, but then you hear about it from other people before entering the study, that could potentially bias you as well. However, again, there's not much data out there because, especially in psychology, the subjects are usually first-year students. So in other fields like economics, where we may not only use first-year students, we can actually not claim that. So other points, like Matt pointed out with a self-refilling soup bowl, there might be studies where we need deception, and that might be the case for a lot of research questions. And in that case, we would go back to that view that sometimes the cost is just lower than the benefit that we get by conducting that research, even if we use certain deceptive practices.
So the AAEA and the American Journal of Agricultural Economics, within the kind of the flagship journal of this, used to have a policy where if you were doing an experiment and submitting for publication, you had to sign a form stating there was no deception. I actually don't know when that rule came into effect. I know because in 2006 published the study that used the Confederate, which, thinking about the harm, like I would argue that Confederate and the experiment caused no harm whatsoever to people. But there was a change, in part because of some of the work we're going to show you in a moment that Carola and I worked on, where the AJAE now, if their policy now is the editor might return your manuscript. If you look at the bottom part of the page here, in cases in which deception is deemed unwarranted or excessive, given the research justification. So it's an interesting thing here, right? The AJAE is basically saying, if you're deceiving, it better be really past the benefit cost test. The benefits of deception, the reason you did it, must be quite clear based on the research justification. And they could reject it even if it's approved by the appropriate institutional review board, or IRB. So it's an interesting thing. So if we go to the next slide, just has a couple papers that were kind of our group worked on thinking about deception. So first some guidelines, but then also surveys of those who are doing experiments within applied economics along with students. So with the survey, I think it was kind of interesting because there was a long list of what's viewed as acceptable and what's viewed as not acceptable. And through the survey, it was looking through then the issue, okay, what does the field think and what do students think? And if we go to the next slide, I think the results for the most part seem to kind of fit what you would expect. There's a few areas where everybody basically views this as the practice should be banned, or at least the median person does. The physical or physiological harm, okay, yeah, you can't literally hurt people, or right, that's not okay. You cannot tell somebody you're going to make the payment and then not pay them. That is not okay. Having somebody buy a mislabeled product is not okay, right? If you're looking at the bulk of things, the majority of respondents said, yes, that shouldn't happen, both on researchers and students. Everything else is a little bit more in the middle, with a lot of these areas where most people saying, no, it's fine. On average, either definitely shouldn't be banned or scale 4 out of 5, where probably shouldn't be banned. Like the use of Confederates, subjects aren't aware they're part of a study, right? There's a lot of field experiments that are happening where subjects just don't know they're part of the study and they're behaving, but the data is being collected. False information about a study's purpose. So you're saying it's about something, but really you care about something else. And you're afraid if you tell them, we want to see what you think about this politician. Okay, they might be cued in on that and they might answer differently than if you say it's about something else and you're asking about, you're kind of tracking something on politics. So kind of an interesting ranking. And if you're thinking of a spot where you might have to use deception to get at your research question, know that some of these, if you tried to do them, probably argue it's morally wrong. I would make the argument on harming people physically or physiological harm, right? That's just not okay. You can't sell somebody a mislabeled product. That's, to me, that's just fraud. If somebody thinks they're buying something organic and it's not organic, and you sold it to them, you have lied and you've collected funds. One that's more in between is the bidding on a mislabeled product. So if you have them bid on a mislabeled product, but then many auctions will have just one round that counts, so you have a different round count, so nobody could actually buy a mislabeled product. People were more in between on not quite sure if it should be banned or not as a practice. So this would be an interesting guideline if you think you may need to use deception in the study, to go to this paper to kind of look at what might be okay. I think you could go to the next slide.
So after hearing all this, the question is deception, yes or no? There are a lot of researchers out there who would say that there are questions they cannot address without deception. However, everyone should always make all effort to really try to keep deception to a minimum. As Matt pointed out, you may go through a full study and you may not be able to get it published if the editors decide that the deceptive techniques that you use are too strong, are not acceptable. However, do all research studies that use deception require deception? No. So that really means make an effort and try to deceive as little as possible.
Yeah, I think that's fair. If you can avoid it for a low cost, you absolutely should. The editors can reject it. The other thing, there are a lot of people out there who I quite frankly, I think deception should not be a banned practice. That's just my view. There are some people who get really, really upset about the idea of deceiving in general. And they have a different view than I have. And if you get them as a reviewer, they might not even say it's the deception. The editor might think it's okay, and if they know, but they're going to do everything they can to tear your paper apart. And the reviewers can be brutal. You might have a very publishable paper, but you can always find flaws in everything, and you could always have that, quote unquote reviewer two. You don't want to create a new reviewer two because they hate deception and you used it unnecessarily. So if you can avoid it, definitely would. And this is from somebody who thinks it's perfectly fine in certain circumstances, as long as you're basically not harming anybody to be able to use. So, Carola, any final thoughts before we wrap up the video?
I think that was all. If you have questions, feel free to contact us. It's definitely still an interesting discussion that is valid in a lot of experiments. And if anything, think carefully about what you are doing and whether any of the things you're doing could fit the list from the beginning, and how you can avoid that to avoid problems further down the road.
Yeah, and I don't know who would have stumbled onto this video who doesn't know quite a bit about experimental auctions, but if somehow you found this and you're wondering more about what are experimental auctions, I have a playlist on my YouTube channel that has several other videos on experimental auctions that you could check out to just learn a little bit more about them in general and some other issues that come up with experimental auctions. But otherwise, thank you so much for tuning in, everybody, and I hope You have a wonderful day.